доклади. Имам удоволствието да дам думата на Артур Степанов, който ще представи своите наблюдения в съавторство с Илияна Кръпова върху номиналната структура на някои подчинени допълнителни изречения в български език. Имате думата.
Thank you. So I'm assuming that everyone is seeing the slides. So
no, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
You're here also.
Okay, my name is Артур Степанов. So today I'm going to present the results of a preliminary study with my colleague, Professor Илияна Кръпова. And so what we're in, so yeah, I mean, I'm going to present this talk in English, but you're free, if there are any questions after the talk, feel free to ask them in Bulgarian, because I see that my co-author is also present here, so we'll manage. So what we are interested in here is essentially the syntax of complements of propositional attitude verbs. So propositional attitude verbs are verbs like think, believe, know, want. Also assertives like claim and say and acknowledge. So basically verbs that express the speaker's attitude or judgment or opinion about the about what's happening in the complement. So I believe that the conference starts tomorrow. Мисля, че конференцията започва утре. There are two views on the structure of these finite complements. So basically, there are two views on the question how these complements are attached to the matrix propositional attitude verb. The standard view, of course, is that basically the clause constitutes a structural sister to the verb, and there is nothing in between. There's also actually an old school view that was popular in the, well, let's say, I don't know, 60 years ago, maybe. And back then, people were thinking of clauses as, behaving very similarly to NPs. Yeah, so on the right-hand part of the slide, you see that this old school view where the complement of the clause is actually attached to the verb through some kind of intermediate NP node. The reason for including the NP was basically distributional, because clauses appear to behave very similarly in syntactic terms. So for instance, they appeared in case positions, they could function as subjects. So everything NPs could do, the finite clauses could do too. So people thought, but maybe, from the way syntax sees them is some sort of NP. So so that sort of view sort of dwindled away with time, and so people adopt more or less the standard view now. Nevertheless, there are still voices every now and then that maybe, well, that was eliminating this old school view was too hasty, and the reason for that is that there seems to be some kind of opacity happening between the matrix and embedded clause. And it's not always clear why that opacity occurs. So opacity means basically that various syntactic dependencies have difficulties going through an embedded clause boundary. So what you're seeing on the slide is basically a more modern or updated view on the updated version of the old school view, which I'm going to refer to as NP shell view, which basically says that, you still have some sort of subordination, but the embedded clause, the sort of what used to be complement of the propositional attitude verb, is actually attached to some sort of a pronominal, let's call it, right, which instantiates an NP structure. So this sort of view obviously has different predictions with respect to syntactic opacity because it introduces an additional level of structure. Yeah? So that has important consequences. So we don't really know what's happening at the edge between the verb and this complex complement, but we do know that in many languages, syntactic dependencies have difficulties going through this kind of additional structural layer. So by syntactic dependencies, I basically mean here long-distance double-edged questions, for instance, where the double-edged phrase belongs in the embedded clause, but surfaces in the matrix clause. So obviously it has traveled some sort of path across the clausal boundary here. So when did everyone think that the conference would start? So basically the prediction here is that if a complement is opaque, then extraction out of an embedded clause should create some kind of an island effect. So an island effect is a structural effect where people just don't accept a sentence when there's just too much structure in between the double-edged phrase and its canonical position. So for instance, this one down here, when did everyone hear a claim that the conference would start, is not good, and compared to the version without the claim, of course. And the reason is because this claim introduces an additional piece of structure, which is, nominal phrase. This is called the complex NP island effect. So turning to Bulgarian now. So, turning to Slavic now. In Slavic languages, what I said seems to be observed more robustly compared to, let's say, Germanic languages, in which these long-distance double-edged questions mostly seem to be fine. In Slavic languages, there is some sort of unclarity with what's happening here. So with questions like "Кого ректорът съобщи, че студентът е посрещнал пред хотела?" First of all, these are complex questions. They're hard to judge, and with verbs like "мисля," think, obviously things sound more acceptable than with other verbs like "съобщи" and other propositional attitude verbs that I'm going to come back to later. So when you push people to give judgment, to give an acceptability judgment, at some point they just say, "Go away." I don't know what to say. So it's very, very much, there's a great deal of uncertainty here that's related to complexity. So basically our interest here was to clarify the empirical paradigm and to see what's going on in these questions with the idea that we can maybe look at sort of more details. So with the idea that maybe the results will tell us something about this intermediate level of structure that I'm referring to as ambition. So in Bulgarian, of course, finite complements can be optionally preceded by "това." So the rector съобщи "това, че студентът е срещнал пред хотела." When you use "това," the double-edged extraction is clearly degraded. So that sort of goes without saying. The judgment here is very clear. "Кого ректорът съобщи това, че студентът е посрещнал през хотела" is no good. The question is what happens without "това," right? So since there are two factors involved in clouding the judgments, let's say, right? We thought that maybe it would be a good idea to isolate these factors, and when we subtract these factors from the acceptability, we'll see what happens, what's left, basically. Yeah? And if after that the question it becomes sort of if we can isolate the acceptability judgment without this sort of intervening performance effect. So the intervening effects are basically two. One is length, right? So the question can be long, can be short. Long is worse than short. And you can have "това," yeah, or not have "това." So one is more complex, the other is less complex. So the prediction, the idea is that when you isolate these factors, you can do a comparative analysis of acceptability with these kind of blocks of sentences and see if there are any sort of relative differences. So two factors create four conditions. So what I call the short condition is basically the condition when the distance between the double-edged phrase and its canonical position is short, basically in the same clause. So "кой съобщи, че," this is a short condition, also minus correlative, because there is no correlative. So "това" is a pronoun that I'm going to refer to as correlative for basically historical reasons. Short plus correlative is кой съобщи това, че. Yeah, that's the question that includes both the short dependency and това. The long minus correlative, so that now we're going to the long question. Кого ректора съобщи, че студентът посрещнал? Пред хотела, so this is, as you can see, this is a long dependency because it crosses this structural boundary. And finally, long plus correlative is кого ректора съобщи това, че. Yeah. So here, this is the most complicated structurally example when you have both long dependency and correlative. So what you predict in this case is the following. Suppose you have some kind of acceptability scale here on the y-axis, and on the horizontal axis you have the contrast between short and long condition, and the type of line shows the basically presence of correlative. Right. So the best example in this block would be, of course, short without correlative, clearly, because there's nothing complicating it. The long correlative would be probably worse. And when you plug in the correlative, the whole thing will shift down. Yeah, so the correlative, because it adds structure essentially. But so that will happen if nothing else affects grammaticality, right? So when we subtract acceptability scores that sort of take care of all these four values, we get zero. Nothing additional affects the grammaticality. So in contrast, on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the situation, the hypothetical situation in which essentially the version with correlative and which is long creates sort of an ungrammatical or unacceptability status, which is worse than the sum of the other three. Yeah, so the acceptability status could be worse than the ones when we subtract all four values of two factors, right? So then that's what we call basically an island effect, which is independent of the structure and complexity factors, right? So that's basically an interaction term statistically. So we did a basically pilot experiment with trying, following this design. So it was mostly a sentence acceptability task, but we also plugged in a self-paced reading component because we wanted maybe to see if people have trouble with essentially parsing these questions. When does the most trouble occur? At which point, the self-paced reading paradigm allows you to do that. So the self-paced reading paradigm is a paradigm in which you read the sentence word by word. So so at every point, only one word shows up on the screen. You read it, you press the space button, the word disappears, and the next word appears, and then until you reach the end of the sentence. So that's the self-paced reading, and you measure, of course, the time between the two space between pressing the space button. So yeah, 2x2 design, crossing length and correlative, 12 blocks of WH questions, 30 filler sentences. So these down here are the prepositional verbs we use. So there are 12 verbs. Each verb, so what the block of questions I showed you was basically tried with different verbs. So these are the verbs here. Yeah. So we tested some native speakers of Bulgarian. They read sentences at a natural pace, right? So basically, we asked them to read the sentence at a natural pace and give the acceptability status on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. 1 marked as наполно неприемливо and 5 as наполно приемливо. So these are the results that we got. These are the results that we got. So this is the scale from 1 to 5. This is essentially the summary of the acceptability score. So we got two types of scores, two types of measurements. We got the acceptability scores and we got reading times. So as you can see, so there is a clear contrast between short and long conditioned and between correlative and no correlative conditions. And there does not seem to be an interaction term, right? So if you look at this, these lines seem to be quite parallel, which basically means by subtracting each of these conditions, we get 0. So no additional effect. So this indicates the absence of interaction, and that would indicate that nothing happens except for this important detail that the dotted line actually represents, the dotted line in the long condition actually represents what? A long question with relative, right? So which is clearly bad, and people are very certain about it. And this is not just the property of Bulgarian, this is true also in other Slavic languages in which there is a correlative preceding the finite complement. This is like generally firm judgment. So instead of saying that there is no island effect in either condition, what we want to say is that there is an island effect in both conditions, right? And that's why there is no difference. So basically, people feel the same about the sentence with a correlative as with the sentence without the correlative, yeah, if we subtract away the other factor. So this is consistent with the anti-shell hypothesis, and this sort of suggests that even when there is no tavad, people are bothered by something that prevents the syntactic dependency of double-edged movement from happening, which is consistent with the anti-shell hypothesis because you can postulate that there is some kind of null relative present there as well. So these are results. So these are acceptability scores per verb. So what we broke down the acceptability scores by different verbs, and essentially, so we wanted to see if there is any difference between long and short conditions. So as you can see, there is an interesting correlation here between when one goes down, the other goes up. This is a sort of interesting correlation that we observed. Reading times. Reading times were consistent across the no correlative and correlative condition, except for reading the correlative itself. Yeah, basically, so you can see the time when correlative is read is much higher in the long condition, which basically means the long double-edged question, than in the short condition when there is no long double-edged question, right? So people are more surprised to see the correlative in the long double-edged question. So there are various reasons why that may be the case, but so we basically believe that this again has to do with the fact how people form a double-edged dependency online, and this has to do with something that I'm not going to go into, active filler strategy, which basically says that you have to integrate the double-edged phrase as soon as possible, and instead of a double-edged phrase, you see a correlative, you're surprised. So that's, you don't expect to see it there. So, but by itself, that finding doesn't necessarily show a latent island structure. So these are reading times per verb. So this again, here you see this interesting correlation between the reading times in the short and long condition. When one goes down, the other goes up. Right. So I forgot to mention on the y-axis there is a reading time in milliseconds, and again these are times of reading the correlative. Yeah, just one thing. The times of reading the correlative. Why that is the case? So why there is this kind of correlation? We think that there is a verb bias. So the verb bias is when a verb has more than one subcategorization. So for instance, a verb can select an NP or it can select CP, but it prefers one over the other, right? So in this case, it might be the case that some verbs prefer overt tova more than others. Others don't like it. And the less preferred this correlative is with a particular verb, the more surprise there is when processing the WH extraction. Yeah, so essentially, this again has to do with the fact that you don't want tova when there is a WH extraction coming across it, yeah, coming across the place where it should be located. Okay, so these are the results. So yeah, to conclude, we basically think there is a fairly decent evidence for the empty shell compared to results of our pilot experiment. There is also interesting interaction between global judgment and the real-time processing, which basically interact, which is itself an interesting result. So yeah, that invites further studies on the fine structure of finite complements. This is good to study in connection with semantics and the respective subcategorization biases. Thank you.